10 seconds from now, a wound in the sky will widen. A man who can't die the same way twice will bet his soul against the law of the universe, and a secret about courage will change the definition of victory. Stay with me to the last breath, because only then will I tell you the 3 words he speaks when he accepts the version of himself he spent a lifetime despising. They called it the rift. Not a wormhole. Not a portal with neat edges and a sign that says mind the gap. The rift crossed the Milky Way like a scar that never finished healing, stitching mirror realities together at angles that made navigators superstitious. In some systems it hung high and thin as a crack in glass. In others it pooled, wide as a sea where ships could sail from one world to its almost twin and swear the differences were only in the light. Wherever the rift touched, physics learned to stutter. Choices echoed. History split. Armies marched through the wound with flags that rhymed but did not match. People met better or worse versions of the person in their mirror and called it fate, or blasphemy, or both. Soren Hale was born there, at a station named Nascent Gate, on a platform where dusk always looked 5 minutes early. On paper he was a mercenary commander, contracts across the fracture belt, a reputation for taking impossible jobs and billing by the miracle. Off paper, he was a myth with pulse and receipts. Half human. Half something older, threshold-blooded, son of a minor god of crossings who left his name in the tides of airlocks and not much else. Soren carried an inheritance that wasn't a talent so much as a sentence. He could not die the same way twice. The first time should have killed him for good, a hull breach, 30 seconds of vacuum, blood boiling into brief starfields. He woke on a medical pallet with lungs that burned and a surgeon who said, "You weren't breathing, and then you were. Don't do that again." The second death, knife in a corridor where diplomacy should have worked. The third, reactor buckling in a ship nicknamed Patient Zero. Each time he fell, the rift wrote a rule into him: not like that. Never like that again. You can build a career on that if you're willing to be a monster for hire. Soren did, at first, because the fracture wars didn't give out sainthoods and his men needed pay. They called his outfit Black Meridian. Their contracts were clean on paper, filthy in person. They fought for coalitions that promised repaired stations and sent thank-you cakes to memorial services. They fought against empires that said the quiet part out loud and paid on time. Soren never died the same way twice and learned to use that like a crowbar. He would take the most lethal job in the room and break its back with the single truth the rift had gifted him: novelty is power. The work ate him the way war eats anyone worth the calories. But that's not why he's here. He's here because of a place called the Ashline Orchard. If you sail long enough along the rift, you find zones where realities overlap so gently they make weather together. The orchard was one. 2 moons, 2 suns, a scatter of trees that refused to choose which physics to believe. In season, the fruit tasted like 2 different childhoods on the same tongue. People brought their dead there to whisper stories across the seam. Soren came hunting an enemy vanguard and found himself. Not a mirror with a better barber. A man his age with his face's bone map and a posture that had forgotten how to scan a room for exits. He wore a teacher's coat, patched at the elbows. A kid ran up to him with paint on her hands. He went to one knee and made a promise with his eyes. "Captain Hale?" asked his second, hand on her sidearm. Soren didn't answer. He was watching the other man watch the child's hands when she surprised him with a hug. He hadn't realized until that moment that he'd been hungry for a sight like that for years. The other man saw him. Then he saw through him, the way family does when they can't stop themselves. "I'm Rin," he said simply. "In my world I kept walking." "Walking where?" Soren asked, voice too harsh for the orchard. "Past the recruitment lines," Rin said. "Past the oath. Past the part where people clapped because I promised to bleed for them. I left the rift alone. I teach. I fix roofs. It's not glorious. It is sufficient." Soren's laugh had angles. "They say that in my line like it's an insult." "You say it like it hurts," Ren replied. "The universe is cruel and kind in equal measure." It let them talk for a while. It let Soren see a life he had never chosen, not because he couldn't, but because he didn't know how to lose on purpose. Ren told him about small victories with names, students who could sleep now, a neighbor who stopped drinking when someone taught him how to build a table that didn't wobble. Soren told Ren about battles that changed charts and cost faces he remembered better than birthdays. Then the orchard quivered. Reality shifted a degree. Soldiers emerged between the twin trees with weapons that were also prayers. The Pale Host, a religious militia from a world where the rift was an altar you fed with courage. They had come to widen the wound by cutting something that mattered on both sides. Go, Ren said. Run. Soren didn't. Of course he didn't. He did the thing he was made to do. He fought. He died. Not for long, not forever. His death this time was fire in the lungs from a weapon that thought it was mercy. He woke to black glass and burning pollen and Ren standing over him with a branch he had used like a blade. I told you to run, Ren said, shaking. I don't, Soren said, and tasted blood. It's not in my contract. That night, under twin moons with different ideas about how to be moons, Ren made tea and said the sentence that changed Soren more than any blade. Your war keeps it open. Soren stared into steam and didn't blink. What? Ren drew a shape and spilled tea on the table, an ugly circle. You die a new way, the rift learns a new permission. Novelty is power. Your deaths feed it. It stays flexible. It stays hungry. Every army that sails through is sailing on the back of your legend. Do you want to close the scar? Starve it. Starve it. The word had weight. Soren laughed again, uglier. I'm a soldier. This is what I do. Ren looked at him with an expression Soren had fallen in love with too late to do anything about. It was pity without superiority. It was love without permission. You can also decide to be done. What do I do then? Grow apples? Maybe, Ren said. Or maybe you just learn how to die the same way twice. Soren's heart stuttered. The law inside him, the law the rift had written in his bones, hissed like a cut wire. Break the rule, Ren said softly. End the oath. You need to know about the oath. Years ago, when Soren was very young and very stupid in the exact proportion that makes a good myth, he stood at nascent gate and promised the rift a thing the rift didn't need but would never refuse. My novelty for your door. He had asked for a power that would let him buy lives from a ledger that never balanced. The rift had given it like a loan with teeth. Never twice, Soren. Never the same. In return, the wound will open for you. The oath had made him valuable. It had also made him a hinge that screeched every time it moved. You're asking me to be a coward, he said, and he meant the ugliest version of the word. I'm asking you to choose a smaller courage, Ren said. The kind that doesn't win applause because no one sees what didn't happen. We like the brave who take the hill. We are uncomfortable with the brave who walk away. Soren left the orchard with a map of places the Pale Host would strike next. He could tell you he fought because people were in danger, and it would be true. He could tell you he fought because contracts existed, and it would be honest. He did not tell anyone that he fought because he didn't yet know how to keep his hands empty. The war escalated. Mirrored worlds fell in mirrored ways, one to famine, one to flood, one to an algorithm that measured piety and found everyone wanting. The Pale Host, the Crown Compact, the Sunglass Admiralty, banners blurred into one long banner named We Were Certain. Black Meridian kept certain people alive and lost others and kept receipts that didn't pay grief. Every time Soren died, a new way of dying left his reach. It sounds like freedom until you realize how narrow the road becomes when novelty runs out. At the Battle of Glasswater, where cities hung above the ocean on cables tuned to wind, Soren was cornered. The Pale Host had learned his law. They fed him deaths he'd already spent, trying to force the one he couldn't refuse. He cut a cable and swung a district out of harm's way and told himself it was worth the screams. The rift flexed underfoot. He felt it. He felt it like breath in his ribs. You know the moment, right? The hinge. The pivot point disguised as a Tuesday. It came in a briefing room that smelled like the inside of a glove. His second, Vesa, who had earned the right to be unkind when the truth needed it, put a hand on a map and said, We can hold them at Fenn's Reach if we bait them with you. You die creative, we get a corridor, the civilians slip through. Creative. Soren repeated, exhausted. Like a cake. Like a man whose next novel death keeps a city breathing. Vesa said, and there was love in her impatience. Soren nodded because that was the thing he was made to do. Then he asked for an hour and walked where the station's light went thin. He put his hand on the glass and felt the rift hum back, familiar, almost affectionate. He remembered Ren's coat patched at the elbows. He remembered a girl with paint on her hands. He remembered the orchard and the taste of fruit that made you choose between childhoods. Starve it, Ren had said. Die the same way twice. How? Soren asked the wound. The answer came not as words but as an absence, the way a room feels after a conversation ends and you're still listening for a voice that isn't there. Don't die. Not this time. Not at all. Run. In the next room, Vesa briefed a plan that required a spectacular death from a man who had made a profession of them. The pale host fleets aligned. The civilians waited for a corridor bought by blood. Everything leaned toward the heroic answer. Soren chose the stupid, infuriating, smaller one. He ran. He ordered Black Meridian to break. He ordered decoys into places that would waste the enemy's appetite. He shut down every beacon that spelled his name. He told lies that sounded like rout and retreated like a man who finally knew how to be hated on purpose. Civilians panicked. Captains swore. Vesa looked at him with a betrayal he will carry forever. And the rift dimmed. Just a shade. Just enough to make the pale host stumble when their knives tried to find purchase in a myth that wasn't there. Just enough to make an admiral on the other side call off a charge because the story she'd rehearsed had lost its main actor. Just enough for 1,000 small boats to slip through a fog purchased with shame. Soren could feel the law inside him flex. He could feel it crack. It wasn't enough yet. One refusal is a dent. A scar needs a practice. He made refusal a discipline. The long drift. The vanishing at high eve. The night with no last stand. Battles with names you can taste and a hero who didn't show up to feed them. Soren learned to take smaller assignments, delaying actions in unremarkable orbits, evacuations that ended in tedium, sabotage that smelled like sweat and patience. He died rarely, and when he did, he died of things so ordinary they barely counted: exposure, infection, time. The rift starved by inches. His legend shrank. So did the war's appetite for set pieces. It was Run who paid the bill first. The pale host couldn't find the hero they'd trained to hate, so they went hunting the man who had given him permission to become someone else. They burned the orchard. Soren arrived too late. That's not a line I'm proud to say. It is the truth. He found the trees smoking and the earth salted with intention, and a grave marked with the teacher's coat sleeve tied to a stick. The kid with paint on her hands had left fingerprints on the stone. He knelt. He touched the earth. He wanted to summon a god and demand an exchange rate on small mercies. The rift trembled. It was close. It was almost ready to heal. It would close if he chose the last and hardest repetition. Fenn's reach called again. The pale host had pulled down the cables this time. The city hung crooked over a sea that tasted of iron and old oaths. Civilians couldn't run. They would need a corridor purchased by a myth who had disappeared. Vesa stood in front of him without a map. I was wrong, she said. We all were. But I need you to make one more refusal. Not from me. From yourself. What happens to us when it closes? He asked. The ones on the wrong side? We make smaller lives. Vesa said. We start over. We build roofs that don't leak. We teach. We fix. We love without needing a war to earn it. He looked at the sea. He looked at the sky where the seam was thinnest. He looked at the place in himself where the oath had nested like a parasite and built family. The pale host arrived with banners lowered like blades. Soren could have made a corridor with a new death and a speech they would carve into stations. He could have kept the wound open for one more generation of miracles that cost too much. He ran. He ran into the city's bones and found children in stairwells and herded them until they were annoyed instead of afraid. He ran through markets and guilt and a map that didn't need him to be anything but fast. He ran from the enemy and from the part of himself that wanted to die beautifully. He ran until the story no longer needed him. The rift closed. Not with a bang. With an exhale. The scar knitted. The sky remembered it was sky. The echo voices went quiet. The carts of war that had learned to follow Soren's novelty tipped and spilled pride. Two worlds that had been one for too long shook hands and let go. He felt the law inside him shatter like old glass. He had died the same way twice, unheroically. He had chosen the same refusal again and again until the universe relented. The price was all the ordinary ones. He kept them. Black Meridian disbanded into workers, parents, cowards of the useful kind, people who say, "Not today," to the fire and mean it. Vesa opened a school because of course she did. The pale host, deprived of a hero to hound, turned inward and discovered how hard it is to govern a people who have lost interest in dying interestingly. Soren wore a different coat. He learned roofs. He learned names that didn't need rank to hold their shape. He learned how to ask forgiveness without adding a clause. He visited the orchard stone when harvest came back and told Ren that the fruit tasted like only one childhood now, and that this was not a loss. One night, a child with paint on her hands asked him in the market, "Are you the man who runs away?" "Yes," he said, and waited for whatever judgment would arrive next. "Good," she said. "I like men who know when to leave." At the end, when no one was waiting for a speech and the sky was a sky again, Soren Hale stood at the edge of water that once believed it had two suns and said the three words, "I promise you." I lay it down. If this story stayed with you, if it made you feel the strange courage of choosing the smaller life, tap like so it reaches the next person who needs permission to refuse a myth. Subscribe to keep traveling with me through worlds where victory looks like roofs that don't leak and children who get bored because nothing exploded. And tell me in the comments, what would you lay down to close a wound the world keeps praising you for keeping open?